When the police decided to release the recording, they wanted to get the voice out there. And they did. It was a big story in Edmonton and Alberta at the time. People remember Amber's case and talk about it, even all these years later. Even at a wedding recently. A friend told me about Angela Lightning, who runs the arena in Calling Lake, a predominantly Indigenous community about halfway between Fort McMurray and Edmonton. When the voice was released, Angela realized Amber's treaty card had been hanging on the bulletin board in the staff room.
No, we just thought some person lost their ID, and we know how important ID is, especially treaty cards, because they're really hard to get. Yeah. So we're just going to hang on to it. And then one of our staff members had his ritual every morning, grab the Edmonton Sun and reading the paper. And then that article came out and about Amber, and I think the voice was released, or at least it might have been she was missing. Anyway, it was an Edmonton Sun article, and he brings it to me and he's like, "Hey, Angie, I recognized this name when I was reading the paper, and I went and realized it's the card on our board," because it had been there for probably over a season by now. And I'm like, oh my God, well, we need to call the cops.
It's hard to know what to make of the ID, if anything. It sounds like Amber had been dating someone in the community, so there's not necessarily anything suspicious about it. But finding it had a big effect on Angela, and it still does. I think she's a good example of how a lot of people really connect to Amber's story.
I don't know. I just feel for the family. I pray for them often. I pray to Amber, help us get answers. And, her poor son growing up without a mom, especially under these circumstances where her name and face is everywhere, which we want. We want answers, but I don't know. I wish there was something I could do. For all I know, maybe she was in the stands watching hockey and I didn't know. But we didn't know her before she went missing. And, the family deserves answers. The young boy. This guy's out there still killing people, by the way. Nothing stopped him. I'm sure there's, 13 years later, how many have he killed? How many more women has he taken? So
we have this guy's voice. Can't it just be matched up with someone? It seems so straightforward. Like I said, this is one of the reasons I wanted to go back to Amber's case. I thought if enough people could hear the voice, her killer would be caught. Here's John Respett again. He's the former Mountie who was part of the original decision to release the recording.
I mean, it seems in a way you'd think, okay, we're going to put this out here. The voice is very distinct. Yes. Someone's going to recognize them, and we're going to solve one murder, maybe 5 murders.
That's the hope, right? I mean, when you uncover information and or evidence to that degree, the hope is that it's going to advance the investigation exponentially because, clearly that individual is critical to understanding, Amber's next moments.
Not a lot of murdered people have that kind of information. Like, how come we cannot find the owner of that voice in today's society? Like, please tell me. They're doing voice recognition on all our credit cards. If I call in, they say, okay, voice recognition tells me this is you, Angela. We don't need to further do any IDs. How come, look at artificial intelligence. How come we can't match this guy, right? That pisses me off. Everything went wrong. But the fact that they've given his voice to society and everybody just kind of listens to it and gets creeped out. Ooh, what a creep. And hopefully the family gets some closure. Well, no, it's more than that. Like, we've got hardcore evidence here. And what do we do with it? How do we do this?
Unfortunately, like a lot of things in this story, it's not even close to that simple. This is In Her Defense, 50th Street, Episode 5, in Cree, nisitawinawâw, in English, The Voice. So The Voice was released in August 2012, and it got a lot of attention. The recording really affected people, and it still does.
So bad, eh?
Yeah.
I mean, I can't even drive on 50th Street in Edmonton without always thinking about this is where that driver for 50th Street.
50th Street.
50th Street.
50th Street.
I was in Athabasca once, and I heard somebody say absolutely, and I swore it was, it sounded just like that guy.
Are you sure? Absolutely.
Went out, and I took his license plate number down, and I was just thinking, maybe this is him.
I think it's worth talking a bit about absolutely. It's a really tough word for Amber's family.
Or when people used to say absolutely, oh, I just wanted to slap them. Anybody, didn't matter who. But now, I'm okay. Because I was talking to you the other day and you said, absolutely. I was like, bitch. But it doesn't bother me the way it did before, because it's a word and everybody says it. But to me at that time, it was like, yeah, it's messed up. It's just fucking fucked up.
I'm sorry about saying that.
No, it's okay. No, it's okay.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Just so you know, if I do say something and it bothers you, you can be like, bitch, don't say that. You can say it.
No,
I won't be offended.
I'm okay with it now. I'm okay with it.
I never realized how much I say the word absolutely, even when I was trying really hard not to.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, absolutely.
Absolutely, she said.
Oh, I'm sorry. Oh, my gosh. Yesterday I was like, yeah. Sorry.
With the voice out there, police started getting a lot of calls about Amber's case. And even though they thought they were prepared for that, it was overwhelming and time-consuming. Before the recording was released, there'd only been a handful of tips about Amber's disappearance. Soon there were hundreds, and every one would need to be investigated. And while the police and members of the public used the voice to try to find a suspect, others were using it to try to hurt the family. Tootsie got horrible and racist messages on Facebook. She's had people make fake profiles with Amber's picture. Once, someone sent her a photo of a large green toolbox and said, "Guess who's in here?" She never changed her phone number, so people who wanted to torment her found her that way too.
So someone called you and you picked up the phone, and what did he say?
He said, it's me. I was like, who's this? It's me, he said. I was like, who the fuck is this? And he's like, you know who it is. Absolutely. Oh my fucking God.
And then there was this man.
He would call in the night, 2, 3 o'clock in the morning. Just, are you sleeping, bitch? He used to tell me. And I was like, no. But I try to keep him on because the police, they put a trace or...
A wiretap or a...
Yeah, something like that. There again, right there, this only happens in the movies, right? Like that kind of shit. And I'm crazy, I torture myself too, because I always watch the ID channel, trying to find ways to find someone or how they do things.
Some of these situations were very public. One of the most well-known happened on a radio call-in show in Alberta.
I'm Ryan Jesperson. I host Real Talk Ryan Jesperson, one of Canada's most downloaded daily news talk shows. Prior to that, I was the host of the Ryan Jesperson Show on 630 CHED.
Can you tell me about that day?
Yeah, I'll never forget it. I don't know why. Just I'm experiencing just some emotion here thinking back on it. It was a moment I'll never forget. It was the 20th of August, 2020. And we have been talking that week about the 10-year mark since Amber Tuckerow's disappearance and murder. And my producer was operating out of the station. And so we would communicate by text message through the show. And I remember she sent me a note that said, a man claiming to be the driver, a man claiming to be the person heard on that voicemail has called in to the show. Do you want to take the call? And I said, of course. And I just got this shot of adrenaline. And so I teed it up with obviously no knowledge of what was going to unfold. And what I first remember is when I said something along the lines of, we've received a call. We have a caller on the line who says he's the man heard on that voicemail caller. And I believe I asked him right off the bat what his name was. He told us it was Jeffrey. The minute that I heard his voice, I just got chills. I don't know. I'm not an investigator, but I thought, gosh, that sure sounds like the guy. Could have been a crank call. Could have been the killer. It struck me on first listen that this definitely could be that person. It was a gruff, gravelly voice. And I had just heard the call moments before. So it was fresh. But I think even if I heard that voice again right now behind me in a line somewhere, ordering a coffee, I think I would recognize it. He said absolutely on the call with me. And I don't know, a real crank call or someone looking to mess with a radio host and an entire audience and an entire province for that matter could study the voicemail and aim to recreate it and pick that signature word and invoke that word and reuse that word or use that word in their call to me. It is possible, of course. But I remember when he went absolutely on the phone, my heart just stopped.
So some people might be thinking to themselves, why are we just talking about the call, and why don't we have the call that, people could listen to and decide for themselves if they think it's a crank or not?
Yeah, this is a really tough situation. I was fired by 630 Ched. I was fired by Chorus due to political pressure. And unfortunately, in somewhat of a remarkable circumstance, it doesn't happen all the time, Chorus wiped all of my interviews. They wiped the archive of all of my shows, and that call is lost.
Chorus said they wouldn't comment for privacy reasons. At any rate, the police said the caller wasn't a suspect, and there were things in the call that don't fit with some of what we know about the case. It's just another dead end. One day in January 2020, Tootsie's phone blew up with messages, people asking, "Have you seen this?" An American man had come forward on social media saying he believed his dad was the man on the tape with Amber. He said he thought his father was a serial killer who'd killed her and a lot of other people too. He was posting this on Facebook and making videos detailing his allegations on YouTube.
We discovered a pattern of missing or murdered people that seemed to follow my father as he traveled throughout the western United States in the 1970s and 1980s, as well as in the rural area south of Edmonton, Alberta between 2009 and 2019, when my father spent a significant amount of time in Canada.
It was sensational. Someone saying their dad was a serial killer and alleging that the police in Canada weren't taking his tips seriously. The posts went viral, even if some of his allegations were pretty out there.
The violent death of my father-in-law in 2018, the murder and disappearances of several individuals in Canada in 2010, my father's mysterious presence at a bombing in Cairo, Egypt in 1993, and my captivity and the potential existence of my twin brother. That would all be reviewed.
The story was covered in the media and talked about all over the place, in Facebook groups and Reddit threads and true crime forums. It still is. If you look this case up, you'll see it mentioned again and again. It takes up a lot of time and space. But the thing is, the RCMP did take this tip seriously. They did investigate, and they say they've ruled this man's dad out entirely. Now, I talked to this guy and his wife, and they sound really confident about the voice they hear on the tape. But they're wrong. We're not naming him because the RCMP say the man's dad didn't kill Amber. And I'm really only mentioning it so that people can move on. Here's Staff Sergeant Travis McKenzie again.
So once again, respecting people's privacy, but has really put a lot of this online.
Yes.
I think it's only fair to his father to say, yes, we investigate the tips that we receive. We looked at him to see if he was a person who was involved because that's our job. At the end of the day, he's not a suspect in our investigation. And I know for a fact we did take it seriously. He was cooperative, and we were able to say you're not a suspect in this investigation.
This situation is just one example of how many people appear to truly believe they recognize the voice and can't understand why the police aren't doing something about it. One woman on YouTube made a video comparing the voice in the tape with the voice of a police officer from a different province who was implicated in a different crime. She did this because she thinks they sound exactly the same.
Are you sure? Absolutely.
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 The voice would lead RCMP to identify hundreds of people as potential suspects. And investigators gathered dozens and dozens of voice samples that were sent away for analysis. But they didn't find the killer. In fact, after years of investigation, it became clear the voice wasn't going to help much at all.
Okay, my name is Chris Seegers, and I work with a company called audioforensics.ca.
Chris listened to the recording for us with a trained ear, and he had some thoughts. With his expertise, he caught some things I've never noticed, even after listening to it dozens of times.
Like, a lot of people think the audio forensics, the main thing is getting the speech, which is usually correct. But a huge part of audio forensics is comparing background noises, because this is where you can kind of pull out a lot of like the kind of unnoticed information. For instance, like if you're driving in a car on pavement, it sounds one way. If you're driving in a car on a gravel road, it sounds another way. And as people going through life, we don't generally pay attention to those sounds very often. But if you're listening to an audio recording, you could hear those things. So to me, the first thing I heard was a car, probably on pavement.
Where are we by? We're just heading south of Beaumont, or north of Beaumont. We're heading north of Beaumont.
And then in the next clip, the car is on a gravel road, but then it slowly changes to something different.
East, right? East. Over down, gravel.
They were on pavement and then moved to a different type of service, most likely gravel.
You had also made an observation before about whether there's sort of a difference in sound that might be a window up versus a window down. Is
Absolutely.
that something?
Absolutely. You can hear the wind on the microphone of the phone at some times, and other times you can't. So it's almost like the window's up and down throughout the recording, for sure.
And Chris thought the tape provided another important piece of information about the voice.
And you can hear the speaker, the male speaker for sure is from Alberta. You can hear that like 100%.
Why do you say that?
The accent.
What do you hear in that accent that makes you think that person's from Alberta?
I don't know how to describe that. Other than the fact that I grew up in Alberta and I know a lot of people in Alberta. And the accent is very like rural Alberta. It's like, I don't even know how to describe it, but that's what I hear. The male in that clip is definitely from Alberta.
This really interested me. So I spoke to Charles Boberg, a professor at McGill and an expert on regional accents. Even with very little to go on, he heard it too.
The person would be likely to be from the Canadian prairies, possibly parts of BC as well. So, the prairie region in a linguistic sense really extends along the eastern cordillera of the Rockies, so it could even be sort of northeastern BC. It would be less likely to be the Vancouver region. But to me, it does sound like this kind of speech that we normally hear from somebody from the prairie region. But again, based on only one word, it's really very difficult. He says, we're just heading south of Beaumont.
heading south of Beaumont.
And that one word, south.
South?
It's not as though he says south, but he also doesn't say south or south or south, which would place him somewhere else. So I think that particular word is, happened to be included in the one full sentence we have, and that one is has strong diagnostic value for placing someone regionally. And the evidence that I hear is relatively certain that the person would be from the Prairie region.
But beyond those clues, there are some big problems when it comes to using the recording to find the man behind the voice. Here's Chris Seegers again. People think, okay, well, here's this recording. The voice, as you say, is really distinct. Someone's got to hear that voice. They know who it is, match them up forensically, and then case closed.
Well, it's not that easy, though, because first of all, someone has to have a voice sample of that voice to compare against the voice on the recording. And you say, everyone's heard this. I doubt it. How many people, especially nowadays, would pay attention to an RCMP video announcement? Almost none. Second of all, voice identification is not actually an exact science in the way people seem to think it is. But voice identification software, or voice biometrics, as it's better qualified as, is based on controlled environments. So for instance, you and I are both talking into a Shure SM7B microphone right now, which is a great microphone. It's very clean. It doesn't have a lot of noise. So if I recorded my voice here, and then you had a voice recording of me on your microphone, and they compared the two through voice biometrics, it would be an easy match. It would probably be 99.9% foolproof. But if you take something like your cell phone, and it doesn't have a huge frequency response, it doesn't have a huge amount of ability to withstand a lot of noise, but the voice may have fundamentals, like my voice is pretty deep, my fundamental probably goes down below what the phone can handle. So when you're doing voice biometrics, it's going to say, well, that's not a match because it doesn't match, because it's not the same. Now, there's ways around that, and people look at phonetics, they look at formants. So formants are unique to every single person. It's how we form consonants, it's how we form vowels, and they show up perfectly on a FFT or a spectrogram. But that requires the person speaking to not be sick. It requires them to be using a clean microphone in a perfect environment. It requires software to analyze that, because you have to write software to pull that information out. So for instance, and if you phone your bank and you call in, when you made your voice ID, you made it with your phone. But what happens if you call in from, like, maybe I use VoIP and I call in from my computer and I use this microphone? Will it work? Probably about 80% of the time. But you're going to get false negatives and false positives out of that situation. So voice biometrics are usually one portion of identification. They're not usually all of it.
So the tape is released, and it's, I definitely get the sense that police were bracing for, okay, if we release this tape, someone might recognize the voice, but also a lot of people might think they recognize the voice. And this is going to be a lot of extra work figuring out what are the scam tips, what are the people trying to be helpful but they're wrong, and what might be a real tip. Mm-hmm. Can you give us any sense of what happened after this tape was released publicly?
Yeah, so so I wanted to research a few of the numbers for you, and hundreds of tips were received, not on the first day or second day, but this phone call kind of just grew and grew and grew, and in fact we still receive a lot of tips. Like I know I believe in the first year there was a few hundred, if not just over 300 tips received. About 7 years ago, they were still receiving about 5 a week. And then, it's slower now, but we still receive tips. We received tips last week.
Wow. So hundreds, if not maybe thousands potentially?
Yeah, there's, I think it was right around 1,400, 1,500 when I last looked at the numbers, and they've gone up since then.
And can you give us a sense of what has to happen with each tip? So someone calls in and says, oh, this is definitely my uncle. He says absolutely exactly like that, and he lives in Alberta.
That's an example of a pretty common tip that we'd receive, or a lot of people would be like, I know who this is. I recognize that voice, the way he says absolutely, or 50th Street. Like, those are the things that people really key on. Anytime you get a tip in any investigation, you try and figure out, okay, was that person in that area at the time? You know, what is this person's background? What is their history? In this particular investigation, a big piece of what they were hoping would turn out to be like the forensic slam dunk on this file would have been analyzing the person's voice. Turns out it wasn't like that. It just, the quality was not sufficient enough at the time for a proper voice analysis to be conducted. The duration wasn't long enough for a proper voice analysis. And so they put a lot of work, time, and effort in going after all these voice tip leads, hoping that they'd be able to take that, like a sample of that person's voice, and be able to hand it in and have, you know, an expert say, yes, that's him, you've got your guy. And it turns out that they've just never been able to do that over the years.
Mm-hmm. So specific suspects were maybe recorded with the idea of having that analyzed?
Yes. So dozens and dozens and dozens of persons were actually spoken to in person. If they hit the key criteria, like we could actually identify that they were in the area at the time, then investigative teams would go, they would interview these people, they talk to these people, you know, see if they'd submit a sample of their voice for analysis, and then those samples were sent to a private company that specializes in technology such as that.
Do you know how many voice samples?
We sent over 30 that were quite high on the threshold. It might seem low because hundreds of voices were collected. Yeah. But really what hampered that and why more weren't sent is we quickly found out that the technology wasn't there at the time. And as we're learning, it's less probative now, because for us to get a voice tip, to compare it, we need their voice from 10 years ago. We can't use their voice today. We need their voice from 10 years ago.
And feeling totally certain you recognize the voice from hearing a word like absolutely? Well,
there's something called expectation bias. So a person will hear this voice and a picture or a person they know will come to their mind. And then the more they listen to it, the more they can convince themselves that is the person. You're almost hearing what you want to hear with this expectation bias. And honestly, we've learned a lot of people pronounce it the same way. A lot of people will say it just with the same syllable pronunciation, and the way they kind of hit it, or let it draw out, and then in the end, it's very common.
For years, the tape seemed like the key to finding Amber's killer. When the RCMP told the family that was no longer the case, it was devastating.
I think that's the biggest part of Amber's case is the recording, the voice. But according to the police, it has no value. They say it's so hard to understand, on top of everything else that our family feels and has to go through,
And then here, 10 years later, over 10 years, boys, then we had a meeting and they said it's useless. There's nothing. But just like when they said my sister was dead, but no body, they want us to keep telling people to report the voice. Well, how the fuck are you going to report a voice when it's useless?
And it's useless because apparently
they can't do nothing with
can't.
it. They can't do a comparison. Like, well, why would you even try to go down that road then?
I'm incredibly optimistic that maybe one day it will be there. We keep seeing this past year and last year alone how changes in technology can help drive our investigations forward. So, one of my hopes is that one day, whatever technology will be out there, we'll be able to go back to that clip that was recorded 14 years ago and be able to help us evidentially, right? Because we've learned that through DNA samples that we had, 10, 20, 30 years ago, where our labs would tell us, we can see there's a profile, but we can't tell you who it is because there's not enough DNA or it's degraded. We now know that they can take those samples and analyze them now. So no value? No, there's incredible value, right? It's just not as probative. It's just right now it's not going to be what drives this file forward.
I still had so many questions about the recording. How did the police find it? What else happened on the tape? And who was on the other end of the line? I can answer the last question for you right now. The tape was recorded while Amber was talking to her biological brother, Darren Bulldog. When I talked to Darren, he told me he still had the full recording and that he'd let me listen to it. Then he dropped another bombshell.
Like, I can tell you right now, like, they know who done it, and so do I.
That's next time on In Her Defense, 50th Street. In Her Defense, 50th Street is made by Kasia Mihailovich and me, Jana Pruden. Our sound design and mix is by David Crosby. Field recording by Amber Bracken. Our managing editor is Matt Frainer. And thanks also to Mark Ipe, James Keller, and Angela Pacenza. Our cover art is a painting of Amber Tuckero by Lauren Crazybull. Our theme song is No Surrender by Ms.PAN. Art direction is by Ming Wang. Our episode titles were translated into Cree by Dorothy Thunder. Our episode today was called The Voice.
Nisitawinawâw is more like you're recognizing someone, right? Nisitawinawâw, you're hearing their like the voice, but you know it's a man's voice. Nisitawinawâw. Nisitawinen, if you're hearing his voice, but not like you're not talking about the man, you're talking about the voice. Nisitawinen.
Great.
So I would go with this one here. Nisitawinawâw.
I know who that man
Mm-hmm.
is. I recognize that voice.
Yeah, I recognize the voice in Nisitawinawâw. I know who the man is. Perfect.
Additional Cree language consultation and translation by Barbara Scott. Thank you to Elder Joanne Saddleback, Carrie Benjo, Danielle Parody, and Amber Bracken for cultural guidance and feedback on our drafts. In Her Defense, 50th Street is recorded at Gabby Road Studio on Treaty 6 territory in Edmonton, also known as amiskwaciy-wâskahikan, or Beaver Hills House. Support is available for residential school survivors and their families through the National Crisis Line at 1-800-721-0066. Kinanaskam T'nawâw. Thanks for listening.